Sound check. 1, 2, 3. So, question is, all right. Sound check. 1, 2, 3. Now switch in 3, 2, 1. Testing 1, 2, 3. It's so disturbing. Why is it transferring that audio with it? Okay. Let's try that one. All right. Sound check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sound check. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Why wouldn't it? What am I missing here? Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Close it and go back. And let's see. Okay. Stop. Alrighty. Make sure we have it going here. Testing. Testing. 1, 2, 3. They're
You know,
just
I-
unmuting all your microphones now. I
I
tried to get it so that
That's the words we used to use.
there will be a sign up that says class will soon begin.
How you
There'll be
doing?
no sound on
Missed
it.
you last week.
So
And
you're,
then you
you're
would click
busy
on one
today?
box
Yes.
and it would be live.
Well, last time Tommy was out
And
there.
I realized
figured that
that's
out.
why I was first thing.
Yeah.
Carrie.
Get away from
Carry
it.
on.
Yeah.
I mean, I know you had the, I get this stuff for Carrie. Remember, I'm the name of the other daughter. Yes, Leanne. I gave it
Well,
to
it's
her.
because there's an extra
I
step
think
I
I-
have to do to make it instantly available. Yeah. Sometimes I forget to do that. But they are all recorded here, it's just, they're more for, just in case someone wants to copy it. Yeah, I'm gonna touch on it.
You want to sit here,
Yeah.
Leanne, or Janet?
Yeah. See,
I don't know why.
well, it is, but what I have to do after each class is to log into a website and tell it to save the file. Then it becomes available, through the service there. And, I
Well, I
forget
guess
to
they
do
do
that.
have a couple
Yeah.
of minutes.
Yeah.
Hey, John, good to
Even
see
though
you.
Cornelius
Better.
just started.
Well, thank you,
on
it's
that.
Your
good to
whole
be here.
family,
It's good to see you
too.
too.
Yeah,
Too. But see, I've been feeling a lot weller today.
that's good.
A lot well.
That's
A lot
good.
weller, yeah.
Yeah,
Not talking better, but you.
yeah, I know
That's right.
Wednesday you were still a little bit, but you
Yeah.
sounded really good. You looked really good. And I noticed Rhonda and Jeremiah were here, but Michael
Yeah.
was feeling a little iffy, so.
We
poor
were
guy.
thankful he didn't get it. Whatever was whatever was in his system wasn't the flu and it left pretty quick, so.
Okay.
Good,
So
oh,
we-
that's
we were
really
thankful.
good.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad.
Well, so he's 1/4 Filipino, so the whole, DNA gene pool's completely different,
Oh,
so.
yes.
He may have a better system than we
He
do.
might. Oh, that's good.
I didn't know he was 1/4.
I didn't either. He has
That
that dark,
explains, yeah, that's,
he has that darkness to him, but yeah. Oh, wow.
Filipinos have dark.
They can be a little bit,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
It's
David
Asian.
David
Asian, yeah.
Maravilla is Filipino,
Yeah.
and he's got that olive, the olive Italian
that's right.
type skin, Asian skin. Uh-huh. Yeah.
We had some friends who adopted a Filipino baby, and he was dark.
Our neighbors next door, when I was growing up, they were Filipino.
Well.
Oh, you do have text. Yeah. Yeah.
You should have. I
So
was,
is that the one that Ronnie gave you, or is this one that Ronnie gave
it's the texts and manuscripts of the Old Testament.
got last week.
And I need
Okay.
Dale's new handout.
So-
Yeah, this is the one we're gonna be doing
Yeah.
today.
Yeah,
you? So Mom doesn't need this one, cause it's,
that's the same as this.
yeah.
You want this one, Janice?
No, I've got one.
Okay.
Oh, did he give
Yeah.
that to you?
He gave it to Mom, and she thought she
Well,
had it.
she, okay.
She did.
Alright. Yeah, you have it because we made sure of that. So here's Wednesday night's questions, the 2 Peter chapter 3. That's the handout that we needed
Okay.
for Wednesday. So,
Well, hi there.
Hello, how are you doing?
You're looking good.
Oh, well,
Let me pat you real easy.
Just in case I
see, it's
can
not just us, Mom. Jack says you're looking good.
Yeah, absolutely.
She really is. She
Yeah.
really does look good.
Yeah.
She has good coloring, everything.
It's good to
Wonderful
see-
to be out too, isn't it?
oh, yes, you're right.
It is. It's good to see you out, so, yeah, I hope you're hitting a high note and staying there. That's what we hope for Mom too. Oh, she's hitting a high note, let's stay there.
Yeah.
Hi, Karen.
Hey, hello. Janice. It's so good to see you.
She doesn't get any older, just gets prettier.
I know,
I
she
know,
just
we're
is
so
pretty,
glad.
yeah.
Oh, Janice, hello.
Hi, Donna. I know Pat's coming, right?
Yeah, she'll be here.
Okay.
We're not late.
I don't know, Bill.
We're here before the teacher. We're not late.
The teacher's not in here, so you're not late.
That's right.
Yeah.
Hey, good morning.
That's this. How you doing?
Better,
I'm not gonna make you laugh.
not better.
It's all right. We've been making her laugh.
Is it okay for her to laugh?
Yeah.
Oh, I broke her ribs, I couldn't laugh.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she's been doing all right. She's been reaching up in the cabinets.
Oh, wow.
Doing exercises.
Like this breathing hurts.
She's bionic.
Now she's been doing deep breathing.
She's not bionic, is she?
And a sneeze.
She acts
I
like it.
am.
I about died when I sneezed.
Oh, I think.
Anybody need a copy of our new outline, which I handed out 2 weeks ago, last week also? Text and manuscripts, the Old Testament is what we're looking at right now. Text and manuscripts, the Old Testament. We're still studying our overall subject, the origin of the Bible, that it has come from God to us. Most recent study, the development of the New Testament canon, and then before that, development of the Old Testament canon. And what we were doing there is just showing how it developed down through the time of the original writings and the evidence of it being in existence. Old Testament times, the Old Testament, and New Testament times with the New Testament scriptures. And now we're going to be looking at the text, the manuscripts of the Old Testament in this study, and then we will then look at text and manuscripts of the New Testament after we finish this study up. Cal, would you in a word of prayer this morning?
Father, give you thanks for the night of rest we've enjoyed, this another lovely day, in which we come before you in worship and prayer, seeking your blessings upon us, and rendering all due reverence unto you. We're thankful for the opportunity we have to study this morning. Such a bless Ron as he leads us in his studies, that we may better understand how your word was preserved through your will, and how man discovered it, and how we can learn about it, that we may share that with others. I'm thankful for all the blessings of the day, thankful for the opportunity to worship and to celebrate the Lord's Supper, to sing songs of praises. I ask that you bless us in our efforts today, and may be pleasing unto you. In Jesus' name, amen.
You need a copy, Mindy, of text and manuscripts, the Old Testament. Handed out first a couple of weeks ago.
I don't think so. It's not all up on the agenda.
Okay.
I think I've got it.
We're going to introduce here what we're talking about with respect to manuscript evidences. Now, one thing, and I've mentioned this briefly before, pretty soon in our study we get to where we have less and less scriptural references because it becomes a matter of looking at evidences that are extra biblical, and we are at that point when we're talking about these manuscript evidences. And just want to begin with defining what we're talking about. A manuscript is a literary composition written by hand as opposed to a printed copy. So that's the meaning of manuscript itself. Now, an original manuscript is the one first in existence, the one which came from the hand of the author, and an autograph is referred to. No original manuscript of any book of the Bible now exists, as far as is known. They're all lost. I think I've mentioned that before, and we need to understand that up front, especially if we're talking to somebody about this particular subject of how the Bible came down to us. It's not known just how the original manuscripts became lost, but several causes can be suggested. Decay of the original manuscripts, wear and tear of the fragile papyrus that the original manuscripts were written on, destruction by enemies and persecution. We've alluded to this before. It would account for some of them no longer being in existence, and even the burning or burial of worn or soiled manuscripts by those that are friends of God's Word. We have evidence that that may have taken place also throughout the time of history. We have more on this particular subject later on in our studies. Now, manuscript copies are those manuscripts of the Hebrew and Greek Testaments which are transcribed or copied from the original manuscripts. Now keep in mind, we don't have the original manuscripts anywhere out there, but sometime or another there had to have been copies made of those original manuscripts, and we're just looking at evidence that this indeed did take place. The manuscript copies are the known manuscripts now in existence and being used to a large extent in determining the text of our Bible. The largest organized collection of Hebrew Old Testament manuscripts in the world is housed in the Russian National Library in St. Petersburg. Just a side point there. John, you need a copy of our...
That just give me.
Okay. You need the one? You have an extra one? Okay. Well, see, last week I handed them out again. Had forgotten that I'd actually handed them out 2 weeks ago, so some of you may have extras on it.
I asked him $2 for it. He wouldn't
Okay,
pay.
all right. Everybody has one that one. All right,
You
sounds
don't give
fine.
me $2.
There's about 1,700 Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament that have been identified, but only 700 are really useful for the purposes of determining the text of the Old Testament scriptures. The other 1,000 are just mere fragments that are in existence. Now, some 700 that are especially useful, they date from the 3rd century BC to the 14th century AD. And of the 700 manuscripts that are useful, a good bit of those are fragmentary. Very few contain the entire Old Testament, but whenever you take all of these together, these manuscripts cover the Old Testament scriptures several times over. And this is the evidence that exists that what we have in these copies does rightfully represent what we have in our 39 books of the Old Testament presently. Now, there's also means of confirming the reliability of the Old Testament text, and we'll be talking about this as we go through this study, text manuscripts of the Old Testament. One is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament scriptures that Bible scholars, authorities believe was in existence as far back as 250 BC, for sure by 150 BC. Also, we made mention of the New Testament references that we have to the Old Testament. We pointed out many places where Jesus referred to Old Testament scriptures, and the apostles and other inspired writers referred to Old Testament scriptures, direct quotations from them, references, allusions to those Old Testament scriptures. That all confirms that what we have in these manuscript copies reflect what was actually in the original intention of God's revelation of the Old Testament. We also have documentary evidences uncovered through archaeology that confirms the Old Testament text reliability, and we have the Dead Sea Scrolls dated from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD, and we'll have more on this also as we go through. I'm just introducing what we're going to be talking about here in regard to manuscript evidences. Any questions or comments you have at present of what I've stated? Now, question that you have on your outline: why didn't God cause the original manuscripts to be preserved? It looks like it would have simplified things a little bit if we had the original manuscripts rather than relying on these copies. Well, the answer is really not known, but two thoughts have been suggested, and I think both of them have some merit. One is that their preservation wasn't necessary. it wasn't necessary to actually preserve the original manuscripts. There exists such an abundance of manuscript copies and versions and paraphrases and quotations and commentaries and harmonies teaching from the early time, even before Christ, to the present day and age, that confirms that what we do have is reflection of the originals, even though we don't have the originals. There are so many evidences confirming that our Bible today contains the same material as the original, that the preservation of the original manuscripts was quite unnecessary. And I think we'll see that as we go through the study. If you haven't studied this before, I think you'll see why that this is a valid explanation as to why God would not see a need to preserve any of the original manuscripts. Now, another suggestion, I've alluded to this before, why God maybe didn't cause the original manuscripts to be preserved is because the original manuscripts might have been worshipped. People are so ready to worship anything which lays any claim to sanctity. You've probably bones and ashes of saints and martyrs, splinters said to be from the cross of Christ, bits of linen cloth said to have been worn by Jesus or by the Virgin Mary or some highly regarded saint, nails from crosses upon which martyrs hung. All these and more have been worshipped. We know that's the case. And some even profess they receive miracles by having these in their possession or by touching these things on it. So we see that mankind in general is very quick to worship anything that remotely lays claim to be something that has come from God, whether it has or not. You may recall Hezekiah, good king of Judah, reformer. He destroyed that bronze serpent made by Moses because it was being worshipped. Remember that bronze serpent, Numbers chapter 21, verse 5 to verse 9? God sent snakes in among the people, and in order to relieve them of the plague, they had built this bronze serpent on a pole, and if they looked by faith to that, then they would be healed of the snake bite. Well, that bronze serpent on that pole was kept some 700 years, from 1420 BC down to about 700 BC, Hezekiah's time. And you can read in 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 4. 2 Kings 18 verse 4, where Hezekiah, in the midst of his reforms among God's people, had that destroyed because it was being worshipped. No material Bible objects have been preserved. If the handwriting of Moses or David or Paul or any biblical writer should now exist, it'd probably be worshipped, thus detracting from the worship of God. Now, granted, as I made mention, if the original autographed manuscripts were in existence, if we're sure of them, then every manuscript copy which would agree with them would be genuine, authentic. And the subject, the origin of the Bible, would be very much simplified. But as it is, we must study how the original words of inspiration were secured by the process of comparison. And in so doing, we ought to be impressed with the fact that God has so carefully guarded the preservation and transmission of the Word that we're able to prove its genuineness and integrity as surely as if we possessed the original manuscripts. That's the object, what we're going to be looking at by these evidences that are indeed out there. Questions or comments on what I've said so far, introducing this subject of Old Testament manuscript evidences, count?
Well, our faith is to come by faith. Our faith is, or our salvation comes by faith.
Right.
And the faith in, which is not a blind faith that accepts whatever somebody says, but it requires investigation of the Scriptures.
That's right.
But if, I think you're exactly right, if there were originals there, they would be worshipped. I believe that they saved the bronze snake as a reminder of the consequences of rebellion, but it became a thing of worship. So,
Right. That's right. right. Well, that lends to this point I was going to make from 1 Peter 1, 22 and 25. We read that last week. Let's look at that again here and talk about this matter of faith and realize that what we're studying here, and I guess the rightful way to say this, our faith is not a blind faith. Our faith is based upon evidence. And we're looking at some evidence that's not necessarily biblical evidence, but it's extra biblical evidence that does indeed have something to do with our faith. Donnie, you want to read first Peter chapter 1, 22 through 25 for us, sir?
Since you have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit and sincere love of the brethren, love one another fervently with a pure heart, having been born again, not of corruptible seed, but incorruptible, the word of God which lives and abides forever, because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and its flower falls away, but the word of God endures forever. Now this is a word which by the gospel was preached to you.
This is one passage, especially in the New Testament, among several of the wicked side, Old Testament especially, that affirms that God has preserved His Word, that His Word exists forever. We've talked about this before. Do we believe that God has the power to do this? Well, certainly believe that God of creation has the power, the ability to preserve His Word forever. And bring it down to us today. And then the next question, has He actually done it? We believe that He has actually done it. Has the power to do it? Has He actually done it? Well, that goes to His love. He loves mankind. He wants mankind to know His will. And the only way for mankind to know about God's existence to begin with, and thus God's will for mankind, and God's plan for man's salvation, and what lies after eternity is for there to be revelation, written revelation of these things. But as I mentioned, and Cal alluding to also, this all certainly is a matter of faith, but we're not talking about blind faith. Atheists, they say, well, your faith is blind. And it's not. Our faith is based upon evidence. Hebrew writer in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, says that faith is a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. We can't see God, but there's evidence out there. We've looked at this in our studies before. Extra biblical evidence that God does exist. And so our faith is based upon that evidence. Well, the same thing is true here with respect to God's revelation of His will down through the ages. We don't have the original manuscripts. We don't have the autographed copies written by the Old Testament writers and the New Testament writers. But do they exist? Well, it's based upon evidence that we have that is not just extra biblical when you're talking about the Old Testament. Remember, in the New Testament, we have references by Jesus and by the apostles and inspired writers to Old Testament scriptures. So there's biblical evidence of their existence, but then we also have extra biblical evidence that those original manuscripts did exist, and we have evidence of what they said in those original manuscripts. So our faith is not blind faith. Our faith is based upon the evidences, biblical and extra biblical evidences of the fact that these original manuscripts indeed did exist, and we have today what those original manuscripts stated because of all this evidence put together. And it comes from these, in this case, some 1,700, actually 700, and we'll mention in a moment it boils down to really less than that, where our main evidence comes from of what the original text of the Old Testament scriptures stated. Have I confused things? Everybody have anybody questions or comments on what we're talking about here and going to be looking at in our studies? Let's look at, kind of generally speaking here, the Hebrew manuscripts throughout history before we get to the surviving Hebrew manuscript copies and the significance of these. Just generally speaking, there's three eras of history that have to do with what we're talking about, these Hebrew manuscripts. And first would be the Old Testament canon era from 1450 to 400 BC. During that time, as we've studied before, Old Testament books were in existence, but then they were copied by hand for generations on highly perishable papyrus and also animal skins. The survival of the Old Testament scriptures, in spite of persecution and exile, shows the determination of the Jewish scribes to preserve the Old Testament books. But we have to admit that no copies of this era are in existence. We have evidence that they were in existence, but we don't have them to where we can open them up and read them, you understand, on things. The evidence that they were in existence at this time, number one, as I mentioned, Jesus, referring to Old Testament scriptures. Most believe that he was referring to the Septuagint version, which was a copy of, it was the Greek translation copy of the Old Testament scriptures that were in existence. The apostles referring to these Old Testament scriptures, other inspired writers. And then you also, as we looked at before, Josephus referring to Old Testament scriptures and Old Testament writings, and the early church fathers referring to Old Testament scriptures in those day and age. They had to have been in existence, you see, in order for them to even refer to them, and especially have direct quotations from them, even though no copies of this era are in existence today. Questions or comments on this era, Hebrew manuscripts throughout history? We don't have any from 1450 to 400 BC, basically. Yes, Pat?
The person who doubts the validity of having these old manuscripts, if they were in existence, that person would have to be able to read Aramaic or Hebrew, whatever they were
That's
written
true,
in,
too. Yeah.
which, thank God,
Yeah,
we don't
that's
have
right.
to read that
Yeah.
language.
And that's a good point. Even if you had the originals, the same scoffers of the biblical text we have today would still be scoffing at it one way or another on things. And that's a good point alluded to. Exactly right. And couldn't be able to read it to begin with, to confirm it, and that type of thing on it. That's a good point. I guess that's a youngster on things. I hear something other out there, and I don't think it's any of you doing that.
Either that or a goat.
Okay. My hearing aids are kind of playing tricks on me here. Okay. All right. The next era, the Talmudic era, from 400 BC down to 500 AD. And what we're talking about here is an era that produced a flood of manuscript copies that were used in the synagogues and also for private use. The copies for synagogue use were made with extreme caution and were considered sacred. By the time of the Maccabean revolt in 168 BC, the Syrians had destroyed most of the existing original manuscripts of the Old Testament, Bible scholars indicate. But there was in this era, from 400 BC down to 500 AD, this meticulous work of copying all the things that we know from Old Testament Scripture. And we're going to have more on this later. You're going to hear me say that several times. So we're going to expand upon these things as we go through this study. And then you have the Masoretic period from 500 AD down to 1000 AD. Now during this period, various Jewish scholars arose dedicated to preservation of the Old Testament text. This group became known as the Masoretes because of their acknowledged dependence on the authoritative traditions of the text at that time. That was referred to as Masorah. And these were the Masoretes, and this is the Masoretic period of time. And what they were doing mainly was showing the correct pronunciation of these Hebrew words. This school of scholars were centered in Tiberias and also in Jerusalem, and They began around AD 500 and continued on for 5 centuries. And their contributions are many. In addition to adding vowel points to the Hebrew text, we've talked about this before, all Hebrew letters are consonants. They added vowel text. They also sought ways and methods to eliminate copying mistakes. And they're very meticulous in this. And again, we'll have a little bit more to say about this when we come back, talking about the reliability of the text that we have. I saw a hand up here. Yes, Jeff.
To me, a lot of the things about the original text is their script. The translations, you know, it took scholars and translators to bring everything into our language. And to me, there's a lot of differences in some of the different translations that mean different to me that might do to other people too. So there's for some people to understand something one way and some another.
Yep. For
For example, there in 1 Peter, what Donna just read, to me where it says the, if I find it here, okay, for you have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable, and hers said corrupt or uncorrupt. Well, to me, perishable means something that'll go away, like die, or, you know, perish, gone. Corrupt just seems to me like breaking the law or something. So there's a difference. I can get a different understanding than what someone else might get according to that translation. So,
well, but of course, what Bible scholars were been doing for the ages, and still doing this too on things, especially when you have all these manuscripts, is comparing all of them and then boiling it down to the best of translations. Now, as you mentioned, translations do vary, and we'll get down to talking about different translations at the last part of our study. There are some translations that are far better than others.
true. And I don't mean all translations
right,
are bad. I
right.
just mean every once in a while, to me, I think it's
Sure,
something that
yeah,
means
right.
really different from one book to the other.
Right. Committee, what would refer to as committee translations, are translations that are put together by 100 people, 100 Bible scholars, and from all different religious faiths also. So you don't have one particular religious faith like the Catholic Church is saying this is the way it is and this is the translation on things. There are a lot of one-man translations out there, and they get it's just one man's opinion of what he thinks that the text should be saying on things. And so Bible scholars, though, look at all this together, and we'll have more to say about this too on the manuscript evidence. And you'll have one manuscript that has a different Hebrew rendering in the Old Testament than another manuscript on things. But you've got 5 other manuscripts here that are in agreement with this one and not with the other. Just purpose of illustration, you see. So pretty soon it boils down to the weight of the evidence shows this is the word that should be used. This is the thought that ought to actually reflect the original and not this one over here. This one may reflect some mistake by a copyist. And we'll talk about that too in another study. Copyists did make mistakes. And that's acknowledged by those that study textual criticism. It's that area of study. But whenever you boil down the actual mistakes that were made, there's very, very few that change the meaning of the passage, the meaning of the text on things. These are all things that we'll talk about more in the future. Cal, do you have a question or comment?
An example of that is, did Moses cross the Red Sea or the Reed Sea? So that's a case there where you got some people say it was called the Reed Sea. It wasn't actually all the way down there, but the Reed Sea. So I don't know exactly which one is right. I haven't investigated because it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, that's right.
But the Talmudic area, they were literally, their job was to preserve the exact words and the exact right. Now, I'm not as familiar with the Masoretic, but I would think that they started out preserving that. They may have changed punctuation in there so people could read it like it originally was supposed to be read, but they didn't change the meaning. Or they did, it was the original word, just with, so the punctuation mark, so you could say it correctly. It's like, we say Yahweh for the, how the original expressed the name of God.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's right or not.
Yeah, that's right. That's it on things. And we'll talk more about, too, the meticulous care that was made in the Talmudic and also the Masoretic period in these copies. They had like a dozen steps that they had to follow in order to actually make these copies on things. It's just some of the evidence that what we have is very, very reliable. Very, very reliable on things. Other questions or comments on this general outlook of the Hebrew manuscripts throughout history? Let's look at what we're referring to as some surviving Hebrew manuscript copies. I emphasize the word surviving. The Old Testament scriptures existed from 400 BC down to 1000 AD. We have evidence they existed. We just don't have the original copies that we made mention of. And these surviving Hebrew copies that we're looking at, you're going to notice end up being about 1000 AD. So Bible critics saying, well, wait a minute now. You mean we don't have any real record of the Old Testament text until 1000 AD? Well, that's when the manuscripts date, but we have evidence that the originals and more copies existed before that, because again, we go back to Jesus and the apostles. They quoted these Old Testament scriptures, so they had to be in existence in their day. And then you also have the early church fathers or quotations back in the 1st and 2nd century AD, well before the 1000 AD. You have Josephus, we've cited before, that cites these things, and there's a whole host of more witnesses to these Old Testament copies being in existence before 1000 AD that we'll also be looking at here. But what I'm doing right now is just relating to you the earliest existing Hebrew manuscripts that have been dated around AD 1000 AD, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1948. These few that I'm going to relate to you have on your list there are the main manuscripts they've been utilizing for many, many years in order to determine the Old Testament scriptures. One of them, the Cairo Codex. Oh, and you may remember Codex Codex is a book form like this, as opposed to a roll or scroll. And we talked about that in materials made used in Old Testament era. You read in Old Testament, New Testament times about scrolls being opened, and the original probably were on scrolls, but codexes are in book form. The sheets are laid and formed together in a book form. The Cairo Codex is also referred to as the Cairo Codex of the Prophets, also known as Codex Kairosis, and it dates back to AD 895, and it includes the former and the latter prophets. Now we're talking about from the Jews' perspective, the former prophets from the Jews' perspective, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, those books. The latter prophets from the Jews' perspective, the Hebrew Bibles, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 12 minor prophets, things of that nature. But this particular codex contains the former and the latter prophets. There's also a Leningrad Codex of the Prophets that's dated in 916 AD, and it contains the latter prophets, Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. It's in the Royal Library at Leningrad, Russia. We have also available at the British Museum in London, the British Museum Codex of the Pentateuch, Pentateuch being the first 5 books of Moses, the law. And this is dated the 10th to the 11th century AD. Some assign it back a little bit earlier, 820 to 850 AD. It's also known as Oriental 4445. If you can look all this up, Wikipedia, or just Google any of these, and you can check all this out. There's just wealth of information out there on the internet nowadays about where these are at and what is contained in all these. But this particular codex exists in the British Museum in London.
And it's in Hebrew, right?
I'm sorry?
And it's in Hebrew.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It's in Hebrew. There's also a Leningrad Codex dated 1008 AD. This is the oldest known manuscript of the entire Old Testament. Hebrew Bible, 24 books, which relates to, we noted before, our 39 books in the Bibles that we have of the Old Testament. This Leningrad Codex exists in the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, Russia, as I mentioned before. That particular library has the bulk of the Old Testament manuscripts that are in the world today. The point, though, is scholars have been, for centuries, scholars still have access to studying those things and still comparing the things that they find in these through the years. Before 1947, Old Testament versions were based on these three partial and one complete manuscript from around AD 1000 AD. And I say before 1947, 1948 is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. There's also an Aleppo Codex dated around 950 AD. It is in the Shrine of Book in an Israeli museum near Jerusalem. And originally it was a complete Old Testament, but not all of it has survived, according to what I can find about it. It lacks the law. It lacks the first 5 books of Moses, for example. But originally, the record indicate that it did have a complete Old Testament. Now there's others. I didn't have that one up there. There's others. Many other manuscripts exist, as I made mention, 700 that are available to really compare things to, 1,700 total. But just mentioning these because these are the main witnesses to the original Old Testament text. Questions or comments on what I've stated here so far? Now, briefly, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1948. Extremely important in that they include Hebrew manuscripts, the Old Testament written around 200 to 100 BC. More than 1,000 years earlier than the previously earliest known manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls include one complete book, Isaiah, and thousands of fragments which together represent every Old Testament book except Esther. W.F. Albright, in one of his books on words in the Bible, called these scrolls the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times. When they first discovered, why people thought, oh, okay, it's going to disprove what the Old Testament text, it just confirmed that the 39 books that we already had in existence were reflecting the original text of the Old Testament scriptures. Now again, this only goes back to 200 to 100 BC, and there are copies also. But before that, scholars only had these manuscripts that were dated about 1000 AD. Now then, they go back to 100 to 200 BC and see, here's evidence that these Old Testament scriptures certainly were in existence well before that 1000 date. John?
How do they know they date 2,000 years before they found them?
I'm sorry?
How do they know they date back to 2,000 years before?
Well, they have different ways. Now, we do realize that their dating methods can be subject to error, if that's what you're talking about. But I haven't studied that out so much on the Dead Sea Scrolls part of it, but a lot of it would have to do with where they found them around the Dead Sea and the tombs, as I understand that they were in, dating them, and then also looking at the material itself, knowing historically what materials were used in that age, the type of writing, a whole host of things would go into determining the date, if that's what you're asking about then on things. All right. That's certainly well beyond my expertise, but I haven't even studied that out so much on things. I'm certainly relying on what I see written about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and relying thus on what Bible scholars have said about the age of them, and then of course the significance of them. I mean, I don't even have access to read it, the Dead Sea Scrolls, to confirm that it does contain Isaiah and every other Old Testament book except Esther. But I believe that these Bible scholars probably are reflecting the truth in that, in other words. Questions or comments on what we're saying here about the surviving Hebrew manuscript copies? Yes.
I was just thinking how many people believe these scholars that tell us how old the earth is, or when it was, and they believe it. They don't even question it.
Yeah, right. Well, you know, I think from what I can understand, when you're dating something 1,000, 2,000 years old, they get pretty close. But when they start talking about something millions and billions of years old, they're likely well off.
Examine it.
You can question it, but you can't dispute it.
Yeah, that's right too. Yeah, you question, you can't dispute it. That's right on thing, because they're wiser than what we are on those type of things. That's right. Good point. Why don't earlier copies of the Hebrew Bible exist? We asked the question, why didn't God preserve the originals? Well, why don't earlier copies of the Hebrew Bible exist? Lightfoot, I've quoted him before, a scholar in this area, says, one may wonder why copies of the Hebrew Bible are late in comparison with the New Testament materials, and especially so when it's recalled that the Old Testament was completed several centuries before the first New Testament book was written. And he says the answer is not difficult to find. He says the Jewish scribes looked upon their copies of the scriptures with an almost superstitious respect, which led them to give a ceremonial burial to any copy which was old or became worn. Their motive was to prevent the improper use of the material in which the sacred name of God had been inscribed. He goes on to say, though, but however noble their intentions, this ancient custom has deprived us of the early Hebrew manuscripts which we might otherwise have, and thus have lengthened the gap between the available copies of the text and the Old Testament autographs. But I emphasize again, regardless of the lack of earlier copies of Hebrew manuscripts, there's still this overwhelming evidence of the reliability of the Old Testament text, because you have Jesus, the apostles, inspired writers, referring to those Old Testament passages, and that's written in the New Testament. Early church fathers referring to Old Testament scripture, Josephus, the Talmud's quotations that began clear back in 400 BC, the Old Testament text. You see the nature of the evidence that's out there. But right now we're just looking at the main manuscripts, surviving Hebrew manuscript copies that are relied upon up until our day and age to give us what we have in the 39 books of the Old Testament. Questions or comments on what we've looked at so far? Our time is same as gone. You can see what we're going to be looking at next, the other Old Testament witnesses other than what we've talked about thus far. So we'll be looking at that, Lord willing, next Lord's Day, and should be able to finish up this part of our study and Then the next study will be text and manuscripts of the New Testament. See, there's a wide gap, some 1,000 years, between the time of finding these Old Testament manuscripts. There's not near as wide a gap between the original autographs of the New Testament and the manuscripts that we have of copies of the New Testament. Thank you for your attention this morning. I don't have a new outline yet because we're not quite ready for it yet.
You're doing a big job.
How you doing?
Has everything.
She's supposed to do
Hey,
what?
Ron, Ron, Ron,
Yes, we'll check her tomorrow.
hey, Ron, look out your window.
Oh, yeah.
Just
one?
Those two, they were honking at you,
You didn't, I heard him.
You hear?
You get here out there.
They came from across the other
Freaking out here.
When did they put chapter and verses in there?
Yeah.
When did they put chapter and verses in there?
That wasn't until, I'm trying to think, about 14
They might.
AD, but the book, chapter and verses, it was a process of time, chapters first, and verses later, that type of thing. And I made mention in our earlier study that that's helpful sometimes, but sometimes it hinders also because they didn't get chapters ended the right way,
Yeah.
begun the right way on
Yeah,
things.
there's
So,
several,
yeah, sometimes
I've
it helps
got-
just to ignore it.
my Bible, you'll get little headings there for topics, whenever a topic changes,
Yeah.
and it may change 3 verses after the chapter
That's right.
change.
Yeah, you might do it. That's right. Sometimes it's, in fact, those that are noted Bible scholars say it's best to ignore them if you really want the
Well, I do ignore them
sense,
when I'm
yeah,
reading them.
yeah.
That's why it's hard to find it whenever I go back to hunt for it, because I've ignored that chapter
Oh, yeah.
verse. So I know it's in a book. But I was gonna tell you, I can dispute from people that says it's 1,000,000 years old, because that book says it's about 3,500 years old.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, exactly so. Exactly
And it
so.
says God created it old.
Yeah,
People miss that in their,
they missed that.
when they say, well, how's it gonna be? Because it says it was created old.
That's right, with the appearance of age, that's right.